Of reporting the news, but from time to time they are also the subject of news themselves. And the Ithaca High School Tattler, the school newspaper, has very much been the subject of news locally and even beyond in recent weeks. It caught my eye, an article that appeared in the Ithaca Journal on May 13th about a controversy that has developed surrounding the newspaper, and in particular some material that appeared there, some new guidelines, and the fact that the paper, in fact, was suspended from operation and looking to the future. So we're very pleased to have on, as our guests this evening, two people who are particularly well positioned to discuss with us the issues that have arisen. And they are, first of all, the editor-in-chief of the Tattler, Rob Ochshorn, who is a senior at Ithaca High School. He's been with the paper for 4 years. He's graduating and will be at the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell in the fall. So Rob, welcome. Thanks very much for coming in. To Rob's left is Roselyn Teukolsky. Roselyn is the newly appointed faculty advisor, and there has been some turnover in that department. The newly appointed faculty advisor, so having the courage to step into the breach of the Tattler. Roselyn is a math and computer science teacher at Ithaca High School, where she has taught since 1979. And I suppose in 1979 you were not teaching computer science, but
well, close.
Close to it, but
not the language I'm teaching today, but close.
Some things were already developing in those days. But in any case, thank you very, very much for coming in. Referring again to that Ithaca Journal article about the Tattler, I noticed a quote from you that I'll share. You were quoted as saying, "The kids wrote inappropriate articles and critical articles, and one thing led to another, and things escalated. Then suddenly we have this big brouhaha." If I can ask, what was it exactly that instigated the big...
To answer that, because I really became aware of it much later. I hadn't realized that there was a problem.
I see.
But from my perspective, what I saw was the students wrote some articles that the administration did not like. I believe that they started putting pressure on both the current advisor and on the editorial staff. Rob will elaborate on that. And I think that relations became strained in the district. And there was a survey that was not favorably received. There was some escalation when the students wanted to do another survey and were not given permission to do it. Just little steps. This cartoon appeared, and I believe what happened, I wasn't there. I wasn't in this
Okay, well, why don't we turn to Rob then, as the person who was on the front lines. Well, in your mind, how did this come about? What were the articles that led to the controversy?
Well, it's hard to pinpoint one specific article precisely because this is a pretty drastic change from a paper that has operated traditionally as an open forum where it is for student expression to one that is called a closed forum. And the district has to be careful when making that change, and they cannot say that it's because of this content, because it would be an open forum paper is an open forum paper, and to close it down based on its content would contradict the whole principle of an open forum paper.
Okay. Well, I know that there are very specific legal ramifications of open versus closed forums, and as they relate to various Supreme Court decisions, and we'll get into that. But
what I'm
if you
getting
could just
at
give us
is
a
not
bit
one
of a feel
specific
about
thing
how did this come about? What, I mean, if not one specific thing, can you give us a feel for some of the unspecific things that
Well, we had a survey in November where 66% of students said that they did not have confidence in the principal. In the next month, we submitted for approval a survey of faculty asking the same question, and we were not granted approval. Then eventually, I think December, we ran a center spread on homosexuality, and on the front page we had an article about students who opposed gay marriage, and some people have mentioned that that shouldn't have run because it might make someone uncomfortable. The next month we printed a restaurant review of Ralph's Ribs that incited quite a bit of controversy for certain passages that were perceived by the owner and several other members of the community as far as racist. We also, in the January paper, had a center spread on cheating and academic dishonesty that caused some controversy, as well as an article.
What became controversial about the cheating and academic dishonesty article?
Well, there were 2 points in that generated some controversy. The first was an article about the ethics of cheating, where in the original version, students, quoted anonymously, mentioned specific teachers where their tests were available from previous years and whatnot. And I talked to the advisor, and we discussed this, and we decided that we didn't want to have teachers identified in that as being easy targets for cheating. So we went through and deleted all the teachers' names, but we missed one. And it was an accident, and we apologized to the teacher, but it doesn't make 3,000 papers go away. That wasn't named as the hugest problem, but that was a mistake and did incite a few meetings.
I have to mention as an aside about the restaurant review. I did happen to find it online, and on the controversial side, I noticed that there were a couple of references to pimps and hoes and things like that. I don't know if that's what caused some of the controversy. I can imagine it might. But on the other hand, I can say as somebody who, by coincidence, does occasional restaurant reviews for the Ithaca Times, the notion that it should be controversial because the owner of the restaurant was not particularly pleased with it, maybe that just shows that you're doing your job by the same token. We're not in the business of writing reviews to please the owners. And I must say it was not the most flattering reviews, and I can't judge its accuracy, but certainly if you're in the reviewing business, you're not in the business of making owners happy necessarily. So.
Right.
Well, I had not heard about the very first article that you mentioned, the one with the survey of student opinion about the principal, and I can well understand that a principal would not be happy to see that in print. Was it 66% of the students were expressed dissatisfaction in some way? Is that right?
Right.
But I mean, assuming that the survey was done in a reasonably scientific and fair way, I'm not sure that I understand the objection to having run either the survey or the article about it. Did you get any specific feedback from the administration or from your then faculty advisor regarding the objections that were made to that article?
Well, with that survey, when we talked to the faculty advisor, the main recommendation was maybe students aren't the only people affected. You should poll faculty and parents. So we decided to make it a 3-part series. But we were not allowed to do it to faculty. And there were 3 reasons that were given that I have some trouble understanding. The first reason was a privacy concern. We asked several demographic questions, and they felt that one could identify a small group of teachers based on their responses to the demographics. The second objection was that it was similar in many ways to a union-administered survey, and they have ways of evaluating administrators, and we were not to be a part of that. And the third reason was that it would not further our education. The first reason they gave about privacy was somewhat legitimate, so we proposed another version with fewer demographic questions that would make one response, something like one of 20 or 30 teachers would be the best guess, which, which is not very.
Does not narrow it down very much.
Right. As for the second, that this was similar to union surveys and not consistent with their ways of evaluating administrators, I don't see how that applies to a newspaper at all. I believe that they would be in the right to advise teachers not to fill out these things, but to stop us from asking is going way too far.
I mean, do you suspect that some of the objections were simply, I mean, let's turn it around. If the survey had shown that 94% of the students were overjoyed with the principal, do you think you would have encountered the same sort of objections?
I have no idea.
Okay, well, fair
I
answer.
find that unlikely.
Fair answer, but it's just
Right.
you know, people being people. It's just hard for me to imagine that, you know, the sort of negative findings from the principal's perspective might not conceivably have entered in. So I don't know if you have a view on that, Russ.
Let me just say something. This is the first year of the new principal. He is an extremely strong principal. From a teacher's point of view, he has a lot of wonderful qualities. He's introduced a lot of structure. A lot of good things have happened. But by the same token, when you have someone like that, he has introduced policies that are drastic and different from what we've had at the high school.
Could you give an example?
Yes. The students are not allowed to eat in class, and they're not allowed to eat in the hallways.
Right.
And this was a directive given at the beginning of the year. He has been very stringent in enforcing the dress code, you know, which reasonable people can argue that, yes, the students shouldn't come to school naked, but he has been very dictatorial, I think, in enforcing the dress code, and this was not true before. Now, since these policies affect the students, it certainly seems reasonable to me to poll the students on what they think about the policies. The policies are unpopular because the students' freedoms are being restricted in ways they were not restricted before. From a teacher's point of view, I love having control in the hallways. I have ambivalent feelings about the policies. Some of them are quite good. I find that the principal is dictatorial in the policies, that even though I might approve of some of them, I'm not sure that I like the way they were instituted. Like, I was never consulted, for example, what do you think about students eating in your classroom? Now, I'm an old teacher. I have been teaching for 32 years. I run my classroom the way I run my classroom. I think I run a very successful classroom. And here I was being given a directive on how to run my classroom without asking, would this make it a more successful classroom? So anyway, you know, Mr. Wilson has caused controversy in the school, there's no question, but he's done a lot of good things. But because there are changes, a lot of the students' awareness of the changes in policy have been heightened. And I could understand that they are not happy with these policy changes. It's, you know, it's normal.
Having been, you know, a student, obviously myself, you know, it's sort of, I think it's natural, like you sort of resent authority figures, and everybody, you know, the principal's sort of always the bad guy, you know, in many ways. And I say that being the child of a former assistant principal in a New York City high school. So, you know, I'm accustomed, but that's just the way it is. So, I mean, but the fact that, you know, the survey might not have produced results that were amenable to the principal doesn't seem, from a kind of journalistic or administrative perspective, to be a justification if that indeed was, you know, the cause for restrictions on the ability of the newspaper to carry out a survey. It seems like a perfectly natural and interesting journalistic endeavor.
Right.
Okay. Now, of course, then there is the famous article that contained the stick figures. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. Well, in February, we had our center spread in sort of a Valentine's Day theme about love. We had articles about teachers who married their high school sweethearts. We had a big article about how sex was being taught in our high school, a sex ed article involving No Child Left Behind policies, how the high school was dealing with abstinence education and whatnot. And because it was in a center spread, we wanted an illustration. So we stuck in a parody of a health class scenario, which I believe you have.
Right, we're going to put that, there it is. Okay. Maybe you can describe to us what we're seeing on the screen there.
Right. Well, there's a health teacher pointing to the board, and on the board are various stick figures in what could be sexual positions.
No, not, I mean, let's be frank, not which
Right.
could be, which are,
Well, they're very abstract.
but which were intended to be, to
Yes,
depict
yes.
sexual positions.
Yes.
Okay,
And then underneath it says test on Monday.
okay.
And it's pretty funny. Actually, the first version that was submitted was very much more out there. It was very graphic. And the students sent it back and said, can you tone this down? Can you make it non-graphic? And so we came up with this, where it's on the board.
Explain that. The first draft of this was more graphic.
Yes, I actually
And you say the
have that.
students sent it back?
Yes.
Who were the students?
Oh, it was the photography editor and myself. This is what the first draft looked like.
We're not going to show the first draft, but okay.
I haven't seen the first draft.
Right.
Okay.
It's very graphic. So we looked at this and we
Yes.
said, and it wasn't funny either. So we looked at it and said, what's wrong with this? And it was graphics.
So in other words, the artist originally proposed this, and you, in your role as editor-in-chief,
Right.
suggested that he tone it down.
Right, working with the photography
Okay.
editor. And so we sent this thing with stick figures, and when I got it, I just started laughing because I thought it was very funny, much funnier than the original, and at the same time, no more graphic than just the letters and numbers around it in the article. I mean, it's not prurient, it's not detailed, it's not, they're stick figures.
Right. I mean,
When I first saw it, I looked at this, and to me, it looked like pairs of scissors. And I thought, what does she have on the board? And, on closer scrutiny, I figured it out. But I certainly did not think that that was an obscene cartoon.
I've looked at it, I found it online and reflected on it. And, my first reaction was, and, here I am saying this when I was in school, but it would have been inconceivable that anything like that could have been published. I mean, it would have been totally beyond the pale. I understand that, school cultures have changed, American culture has changed, and it is not nearly so shocking as it would have been. Now, maybe that, is a sad reflection on American culture or school culture. I don't know. But I do take the point that the intention was not to titillate or to be prurient. On the other hand, again, putting myself back, what I was like when I was, let's say, a 14 or 15 or 16-year-old boy, it didn't take much. Even a stick figure, might have been good enough. But then again, maybe that's, that was my problem, where your adolescent boy's problem, and not necessarily the problem of the paper.
May I interject? You said 14, 15, 16. I want to say 15, 16, 17, 18. That's our population.
Right. Well, I was gone by the time I was 16, so I can only relate to then from high school. In high
No,
school.
I mean,
Right.
I showed this to someone, and her reaction was, surely you don't want 13-year-olds looking at that. And what I wanted to say was, you look around and see what 13-year-olds are bombarded with in this culture. You show a 13-year-old that, he will laugh because it's so tame.
But
Now,
again, isn't that sad? I mean, so do we
That's
want
sad.
to? I mean, do we want to try to change that, or do we want to try to just go with that flow?
Well, my feeling is that it worked in context. You take that cartoon out of context and just put in a dirty cartoon, certainly as advisor, I would nix that, no question. But given that this was on a center spread about censorship, because the censorship issue had already surfaced. So it was a center spread about.
Well, that's later. Originally it was on a Love Center spread. We'll get to there. We ended up printing it independently in the March issue in a spread about censorship. But I mean, right now we're still in February in the Love Center spread. But
Okay. So, or there, again, I went online. I tried to find what I could find online, and these were what we've touched on now are the most controversial things that I saw. Is there anything else that our viewers need to know about to get a feeling for the sorts of things that sparked the controversy?
I mean, that's basically it in terms of content. They haven't named specific content and have tried, I mean, in their view, they're claiming that the guidelines are a representation of how the paper has always operated, which is in pretty direct conflict with what the previous advisor has said and wrote about it. But I think that's the main content things have been covered. If we want to get to where we're publishing independently as the issue, in March, that distribution of this paper was actually denied in the high school because we decided to run in our little spread about censorship, the cartoon, in a context of all of this, which was, taking it to the next step and actually denying this paper from being on campus.
Right. So, in other words, the Tattler was suspended from publication as an official school publication in March.
Implicitly. What happened was, in February, a few days after that paper came out, then advisor Stephanie Vinch resigned. And in the new guidelines, story ideas have to be submitted to the advisor. Everything has to be approved by the advisor at every step. So it essentially halted publication.
I have to say that in approaching tonight's show, I didn't really know, what my own attitude was about this. And when I went online and tried to get, because the Ithaca Journal article was rather vague about what the issues were or what the stories were that were creating the controversy, it was hard to know just how outrageous were things. So when I went online and found what I could find, and then have had it supplemented by you this evening, I have to say, and this show is called Right Angle after all, so we're not, we don't bend over backwards to, have a liberal approach to the issues necessarily. But I don't find anything shocking or offensive. And just in meeting you, Rob, I have to say that I don't sense that you're a firebrand whose desire it is to go out and offend and scandalize people with salacious material. That you seem to be a pretty level-headed person to me. So I'm just trying to understand why this has all come about, and I'm not sure that I have a real sense of what has happened or why it's happened, other than I take my antenna go up when I hear about that study of the principal's popularity.
Let me read something. This is something I found in the Ithaca Journal yesterday. It's about the orchestra. It's an article about the orchestra, and it says the school newspaper, the Tattler, founded in 1893 by Mary Elizabeth Reed and her sisters, editorialized consistently in favor of the arts. They didn't have an orchestra at that time, so including both vocal and instrumental music, a remarkably sophisticated stance considering the youth of its editors and the newness of the school. And I read that with a shock of recognition. I said, oh my goodness, because these kids are unbelievably sophisticated. You have met Robert. There are a bunch of editors who are incredibly sophisticated. They do not put out a newspaper that is a public relations pamphlet for the school, though they write a lot of positive articles. They actually are real journalists a lot of the time. They do interviews. They write articles in the community. They did a good spread on the school board election. Things of interest in the community. We have movie reviews written that are so outstanding that these students could be hired as reviewers, as journalists for a regular newspaper. Now, I think if you pick up your average newspaper in the country, you're not going to find that. The quality is excellent. The independence of the students is excellent. They go off the rails. Believe me, they go off the rails. They're kids. They, they think they're so grown up, but they're not always. But this is a sophisticated publication. And taken as a whole, it didn't conform to what one's idea might be of a student high school publication.
That was my impression,
And I think that this trod on toes, but the situation did escalate. It's not clear to me, and I may be wrong, I'm very new at this. It's not clear to me that if that cartoon had appeared for the first time in the love spread and the advisor had not flagged it I think we may well have gone on to the next event. The point is that that cartoon came at a time when there had already been an escalation. And
So it might have been the last straw in some way.
Well, I mean, it was already past the last straw for us because it was published about a week after the new guidelines had already been imposed on the paper. And it was the first casualty from those new guidelines. But I guess the next would be the paper itself. But it was after something had provoked the administration to enact new guidelines.
Let me ask you, Rob, about how you see what ideally the standards should be applying to a school newspaper. And the way I would frame it is this. Do you think that the Tattler or any school newspaper should have the absolute same freedom of press as a private sector newspaper? That anything that can be published in the Ithaca Journal, for example, although it's, the Ithaca Journal is hardly a cutting-edge avant-garde, but I mean, take the most avant-garde magazine or newspaper in the United States that keeps inside libel or pornography laws. Do you think that the Ithaca High School newspaper should be subject only to those standards, or can you accept that as a high school newspaper addressed to a high school audience, being paid for with taxpayer funding, you are subject to somewhat different standards?
Well, almost the same as a private newspaper. In a 1969 Supreme Court decision of Tinker v. Des Moines, there's one more standard that has been taken to apply to open forum high school newspapers, and that is no article can cause a substantial and material disruption of the educational process. An example of that would be instructions on how to hack into the school's security networks.
But which might be illegal under any circumstances.
Right, or I mean just orders telling students to link arms in the hallway to prevent the flow of people. Those are examples of things that would be excusable in most papers, but there are certain things that cannot be printed in a high school newspaper.
Well, let's talk about sexually explicit materials. Obviously, you can pick up magazines that are extremely explicit.
Right.
Do you think that you should be permitted to publish? I mean, you showed me, and we did not show our viewers, the original drawing that was extremely explicit. Do you think you should have the right to do that?
The right, I mean, that's hard to say. I think that one...
Why is it hard to say?
Well, I mean, a right is different than a responsibility. So I don't think we should have printed it under any, under any set of guidelines.
And after all, you did exercise your own independent editorial discretion to change that without having heard from the administration or from a faculty advisor. Is that right?
Right. I mean, and I'd be hesitant to say that I don't want the right to print it because I don't believe it was legally obscene looking at it. I think it was indecent, probably, and vulgar. But I wonder what else could be cut if we were to say that we do not have the right to publish that. So I'd rather have the right but not do it for something like that. And I think that responsibility is something that the school really should be working on in a newspaper.
Along the same lines, Roselyn, how do you see your responsibility and role as the new faculty advisor? What sort of, leaving aside whatever guidelines may have been imposed by the school, how would you intend to apply your own discretionary authority?
well, this is a very interesting question given the state now of the Tattler and the lawsuit and my recent appointment. I think that the school district thinks that I'm going to follow the guidelines, and I think that the students think I'm going to let them put in whatever they want. And they're all wrong. They are all wrong. Mm-hmm. I will use my judgment too. Mm-hmm. So I will say absolutely for a high school, no gratuitous obscenity. Mm-hmm. I think we can use our wonderful vocabulary, which mm-hmm. Robert obviously has, mm-hmm. to write things without using obscenity. I would say no graphic sexual content. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's necessary. Mm-hmm. You know, I think that things can be far more titillating and interesting if you leave some things unsaid. Mm-hmm. So, but you know what? I wouldn't impose that. What I would do is I would sit around and speak to the students. you know, there's no such thing as absolute freedom of speech. I don't believe that for a minute. As Robert said, with freedom of speech comes responsibility. And hopefully we could have a meeting of the minds and use our judgment and use rational argument to decide what goes in. And my feeling is that if a student ignored me, suppose a student said, you know what, I'm going to put this in because I want my freedom of speech. Well, maybe we'll take that student off the next issue. We won't shut down the newspaper, but maybe we'll take that student off the next issue. Getting back to the Ralph Ribs, okay. The student who wrote that article was extremely distressed at the reaction of the public and Ralph's Ribs and the school, and wrote a wonderful retraction, wrote a wonderful apology, et crow. And this is what you would hope the school newspaper would
Which is not on the menu at Ralph's Ribs, I think we should make clear.
No, it's not.
Right.
It's not. But this is what you would hope. You would hope that this would be a learning experience for students. It's a wonderful newspaper, a wonderful publication with a wonderful tradition. And you want it to be a learning experience. And it seems to me that that was a learning experience. Everyone makes mistakes. Even the professional journalists make mistakes.
Roselyn, you made reference to the school guidelines, and I think we've prepared a graphic that actually has at least an excerpt from those guidelines, I think, as they appeared in the Ithaca Journal. Maybe we can, if we have those, can we pop those up on the screen? There it is. Excerpt from school guidelines. The Tattler advisor, meaning you, Roselyn, shall read, edit, and approve all articles prior to publication. The advisor may, quote, change, edit, or remove any content that would substantially interfere with the district's work or impinge upon the rights of other students, or is inconsistent with the legitimate pedagogical concerns of the district. These include poor grammar, bad research, libel, bias, or prejudice. Now.
Wait.
Uh-huh.
Wait,
okay.
because I ended the sentence here. Libelous, vulgar, profane, unsuitable for immature audiences. Well, I want you to know that I teach some kids. I won't mention any names because I'll get into trouble. They act like 2-year-olds. Any article in the newspaper might set them off. That is so subjective. Immature audiences. Again, one hopes that people of good judgment can speak about things and agree, but that is extremely subjective. How can one sign off to that?
You know, you've raised a couple of things that have fascinated me. You, if I understood what you said clearly, you stated a great independence in your approach to this issue, that you will neither accede to, you know, Rob's standards necessarily, nor will you necessarily enforce the guidelines. Now, this raises an entirely different issue of how you see your role. First of all, you are ultimately an employee of the school district.
Absolutely.
And yet you have announced here on stage that you will not be enforcing what presumably is, you know, an official order of the school district.
Well, to be fair, I did state this. I did state this. I didn't represent...
So they knew what they were getting when they appointed you.
I did not represent myself as anything that I'm not. Students know me. You might say then, why? You know, I've been bumping into people, friends of mine, other veteran teachers, who've said to me, why? What possessed you to take this position? You are going to get into trouble no matter what you do. And the answer is, 1893 was when the newspaper started. It's very important to me that the Tattler continue. It is a wonderful, wonderful tradition at the high school, and I don't want that to stop. But I teach these kids, and they are extraordinary. You might say, how can you stay in a job for 32 years? You know, we're in the trenches. Teaching is tough. Well, these kids are marvelous. I love them. They're wonderful. They're misguided. They're obstreperous, precocious beyond words, but wonderful. They're wonderful. And that is the reason. And if the kids don't take my advice and my counsel, then I'll quit straight away. Because then what am I doing here? That's the reason, to work with the kids. To work with the kids and try and convince them of what I perceive as right. I would never have disallowed that survey. I would have let that cartoon go through.
Well, I hope that...
However,
Yes, please.
However, I was handed something, and I won't tell you who, and I won't tell you what context, but it essentially was 3 paragraphs of extremely explicit sexual content. And I must have spent about 2 hours composing an essay to the student who wrote it on why this is not appropriate. You can make the same point without being explicit. Not only should the school newspaper not publish this, the Ithaca Journal shouldn't, the New York Times shouldn't.
And how did the student ultimately react to that?
Wonderfully. He rewrote it, and it turned out to be a wonderful piece. And I felt so proud of that little paragraph. Robert knows what I'm referring to. And I would like to say that Robert flagged it. Robert took it out and said, I would like you to look at this, because he already knew. And it just was important to me to convince and I didn't just take a rubber stamp and go, no way. Because it's so important to me that the students understand what is appropriate and what is not.
Well,
And I can't put it in words, it's very hard.
as I suggested at the top of the show, I think you have demonstrated courage in stepping into this controversial situation, and you obviously have a passion for the students and for the tradition of the paper. And I was going to ask Rob, I suspect, and I certainly hope that you appreciate the fact that Mrs. Teukolsky has been willing to step in the way that she has.
And one of the big things that we're wondering is how long she'll be able to keep that position. One of the things in the guidelines we proposed that is sort of blatantly missing from their guidelines is any mention of advisor or job security. I'd like to read you the paragraph from the Student Press Law Center guidelines that we proposed. Quote, "The student media advisor is not a censor. No person who advises a student publication will be fired, transferred, or removed from the advisorship by reason of his or her refusal to exercise editorial control over student media or to otherwise suppress the protected free expression of student journalists."
No, these are proposed guidelines, correct, from a sort of an organization that promotes freedom for the student press. And so these are not guidelines that in fact are applicable in the school. But you do touch on a point in terms of your job security that at the top of the show, let me finish this thought if I might. At the top of the show, you made some fairly, I would say, quite candid comments, both positive and critical, about the new principal at the school. And it occurs to me, you know, there's often this issue that we hear discussed of the need or not for tenure for high school teachers, that some people feel that whereas it's a good idea at the collegiate or university level, it's unnecessary at the secondary school level. And yet, it seems to me that you perhaps have given a good illustration of why it might be a good idea, because I think were there not tenure at the secondary level, you might have been hesitant to express some of the views that you did this evening.
Perhaps. This is what I wrote. What if the advisor and the editor reach consensus, but the district feels that the content is inappropriate after publication? Will the advisor be fired?
No, I mean, I think ultimately, obviously, this is very touchy. I mean, the advisor could be fired in the first instance, and then, one could imagine litigation ensuing from that, and who knows. But obviously, the board and, the superintendent and the board of education have ultimate responsibility and ultimate authority, subject to judicial intervention. Let me see if I can get on to related topics. You made reference to the dress code. And of course, dress is also a form of student expression or First Amendment expressions. I'm vaguely aware of some controversy in the school from a year or so ago. And the way that I came to know about this is the son of one of my employees is a student at the school. And I would say he's a country guy who loves to hunt and fish, and every hour that he's not in school, I mean, he actually, even as a young teenager, has been a fishing guide and creates lures. I mean, he spends his life out in the woods. And so for him, wearing camouflage to school is not by any means necessarily a political statement. It's just how he lives his life. And yet, my understanding was that there were certain restrictions placed on wearing camo gear, you know, as some sort of political expression. And so my question for you is, to what extent do you think the same First Amendment freedoms that you would like to apply to your newspaper should apply to students' ability to express themselves through dress?
It's sort of an interesting question. The camouflage is a very loaded thing. There was a big...
No pun intended.
No. There was a big fight that was racially charged by most accounts, and a threat ensued that anyone who wore camouflage would be beat up. And in sort of an act of solidarity, a lot of people wore camouflage to school. And in some ways, it was a rural versus urban conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have characterized it as white versus black. I'm not quite sure. I think that geographic areas are more relevant. But in any case, for some time, camouflage did have quite some meaning, and you know, it was not abstract. There was reason to believe it could have provoked violence. In the instance that you described, it seemed like a pretty innocent...
Mm-hmm. But let's examine that. You say it could have provoked violence.
Right.
You know, this was also an excuse that was used in the old Jim Crow South. Oh, we can't, you know, we would let blacks do this or that or eat here and there, but it could provoke violence. If we were to let them march or something, it could provoke violence. So, you know, but obviously the fair thing to do is not to punish the people who might provoke the violence of the other people.
Right.
It punish the people who might do violence. So, I mean, why restrict the freedom of someone to wear camouflage if somebody else is going to attack them for it?
No, I very much agree with you. And I mean, it was pretty clearly symbolic speech,
Mm-hmm.
which is entitled to some degree of protection. I think a line...
Let's explore that. Or should there be limits in the high school? Should somebody be allowed to wear a Confederate flag T-shirt?
Well,
Should
that's sort of
somebody
where I'm
be
getting
allowed to
to.
wear a Nazi T-shirt? Should there be any limits?
Someone did wear a Ku Klux Klan outfit during this same phase,
Mm-hmm.
and that was not allowed. It was
How do you feel about that?
That's a very tough question.
Why?
Well, I mean, from a lot of different perspectives. I mean, his personal safety was most likely endangered.
But again, that just takes us
Right.
back to the point that I'd made before.
Right.
Isn't it the school's duty to
I mean,
provide for
it's
the personal safety?
Perhaps, but maybe the way of providing for it is providing a sweatshirt to wear. And it's also very likely to really offend a lot of people. And I don't have a good
And so by the same
opinion.
token, you should not be allowed to publish anything that might offend people?
I don't have an opinion on wearing Ku Klux Klan shirts
But
to
why,
school.
why are you such an absolutist when it comes to defending your own rights to publish things that it might be offensive to some people?
I don't think I am an absolutist.
But when it comes to others, should somebody be allowed to wear a Black Power T-shirt showing somebody with a raised fist?
I think it has. If you were to make a regulation like that, it would have to be content neutral.
Should somebody be allowed to wear a T-shirt saying, "It is my deeply held First Amendment political belief that one race is superior to another race"?
I mean, it's really hard to say. At some point, within the job of the school as an educational institution, if it is unable to perform its duties to educate, there need to, it has some leeway to.
And the same thing would
that.
apply to your paper then?
I don't think that we would be able to publish a white or black power.
No, but you didn't.
I mean, it's all about
It's
context.
not a question of be able
And
to.
it's also- right.
When I questioned you on the limits of freedom for your paper earlier in the show, you said you were not willing to necessarily recognize any restrictions on your rights. You said as a practical matter there might be some, but you were not willing to grant the point that there
Right.
should be some. So why don't I ask you the same question? Are you willing to be consistent about others then, with their rights?
I mean, I think it's also important how it's presented. I think that there are ways to present, I guess, a white power argument. Through dress is tricky, but I guess you could do it in a way. I mean, the example you gave, my First
I mean,
Amendment
the fact that people are
protections.
reacting very strongly to it seems to me to suggest that it is very eloquent in its own way.
Right.
If I may say something, we had a letter to the newspaper, in the underground newspaper, before I was the Tattler advisor. And this was a letter that wasn't exactly spewing invective, but it came pretty close against homosexuality. And it was a letter, and it was sent as a letter to the editor. And the question was, should they publish that? Because Ithaca is a liberal community, Ithaca High School is a liberal high school for the most part, and this...
Glad to hear you recognize that fact.
This was extreme, absolutely proud of that fact. This was extremely provocative and certainly something that would not be appreciated. And the question was, should it be published on the letters to the editor page? And my feeling was absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. You cannot present yourself as a bastion of free speech and not print that letter, because we had run letters, I'm already part of them, before I was part of them, they had run letters on homosexuality and on gay marriage, and it seemed important to me that they should put this on the opinion page. Now, the opinion page is very different from the rest of the newspaper. I mean, recently there was this issue in the Ithaca Journal. Somebody wrote an extremely offensive opinion piece that was construed as anti-Semitic by a lot of people. And what was shocking to me is that the letters to the editor were not attacking that person for their views, your idea about attacking the perpetrator, but it was attacking the newspaper for printing it. And that to me was shocking, just shocking, because on the opinion page, there's a lot more stuff that goes. You know, again, there isn't absolute freedom of speech, not even on the opinion page. You have to use your judgment. But if it's an abhorrent view, it has to get airspace, because we're training our students. We are an intellectual and educational institution where we want our students to look at this and say, this is wrong, or I disagree with this, or let's argue about it.
And again, abhorrent in whose eyes? I mean, you know, I didn't see that letter. I don't, you know, I can't judge it, but I would imagine that if you simply reproduced excerpts from Deuteronomy on the issue of homosexuality, it might be extremely offensive and abhorrent to certain people, but those would be views that were maintained by a majority of Americans. So, you know, who's to say? I mean, isn't that the whole point, really, about First Amendment freedoms? Let's see if we can, you know, we're coming towards the last 10 minutes of the show, and I'd like to perhaps get onto some other related issues, but let's talk a little bit about the future of the Tattler. Do I understand that there's going to be one last issue coming out before the end of the school year?
Yes, and it will be a Tattler.
With the official imprimatur of the school as an official publication, no longer an online publication?
Right, it wasn't. I mean, it was a print publication.
Print
before,
publication, but not an official publication.
Right.
And can you give us a sneak preview of what you have in mind? Do you think it's likely to provoke controversy in the same way that some of your other recent issues have?
I would be disappointed if it didn't.
Have you written anything, you know, as a reporter or journalist as well as an editor for it?
Right, yeah. I'm writing some things for this one.
Do you want to give us, again, a little sneak under the tent of what you might have in mind?
Well, sure. I'm writing a retrospective about the whole process so far in terms of, you know, just pretty much everything in terms of the censorship. And then there are a few other leads that I'm working on. I'm writing a retirement spread for one of our teachers who's been here for a while.
So a beloved teacher who's retiring kind of thing?
Right. We have, there are a few of them being written. And then there's something that may or may not turn out to be a story about the English media class, which may or may not be offered next year. But I don't know enough about that yet.
Any of the content that you felt that you had to intervene with respect to?
I have not seen the finished product, so I'm going to be very mum.
I see. Okay. Okay. I'd like to turn to a related issue, but any final thoughts that you'd like to share on the issue of the Tattler and its past and future before we move on?
Well, one thing we didn't mention that you talked earlier about was we have retained the services of a local attorney, Ray Schlatter, who is representing us pro bono and will most likely file within the next week or two.
And what are you seeking?
Better guidelines, mainly.
You're seeking guidelines that would be consistent, in your view, with what you believe to be the controlling Supreme Court ruling in this area. Is that right?
Correct. There are two major cases, Tinker and Hazelwood. And in the Hazelwood decision, they defined two kinds of papers, an open forum paper and a closed forum paper. I would like a set of guidelines that set up the Tattler as an open forum paper.
And just for the sake of our viewers, if I understand correctly, if it's a closed forum, if it's in essence part of the teaching curriculum, like a
Right.
journalism class, then
Right.
there can be relatively more controls. And if it's if it's just a journalistic endeavor by the students, then it is subject to less restrictive sorts of standards.
Right.
And you're saying this is that sort of open forum that should
Right.
have the less restrictive guidelines.
Yes.
Okay. And so you're thinking you might actually have to file suit.
Yes. Negotiations haven't worked very well. I mean, even before we had a lawyer, the district had sort of locked down in this mode where nobody was allowed to talk to us about these issues. So it was very difficult to make any progress just as
Do you feel that
people.
this current issue will be challenging, will be viewed by, maybe it's hard for you to speculate, but do you intend for your current issue to challenge the guidelines that the district is seeking to impose?
The guidelines of the district, they didn't impose them. They are currently, I guess, governing the paper. We would hope to change those through litigation.
Okay.
I would like to say that the litigation puts me in a very difficult position. I feel a little schizophrenic because I am a great champion of these students and the editorial staff of the Tattler, but I am part of the school district and I am the school district representative. You know, I'm very pro Ithaca High School and the Ithaca School District. I love working here. So, in effect, they're also suing me. And I feel that I am in the middle. And I want to make it very clear that I'm not involved in this lawsuit.
You know, I mean, frankly, you know, far be it from me to, and I happen to be a lawyer, but to advise, far be it from me to advise you or your distinguished counsel in this matter. But it does seem to me that based on everything I've heard, and particularly given Mrs. Teukolsky's involvement in this, you have the opportunity to work this out in a responsible adult way that does, you know, to look at litigation as a sort of panacea, I think is unrealistic. And I think it would be just a much happier outcome for everyone involved if you could avoid that. And again, particularly given Roselyn's involvement, I think,
Right.
I think you really do have the chance to do that. And you know, my personal sentiment would be you should take advantage of that rather than trying to raise the stakes and limit people's flexibility by going to litigation.
Well, it's not an issue of we're able to. I mean, this has been an issue since mid-January that we've been trying to work out respectably, diplomatically. And the district has been very blunt with us. This is Hazelwood. We are not compromising.
You know, they might say that, and they might think that, but at the end of the day, you're going to produce a paper under Roselyn's guidance, and it's going to be a certain kind of paper. So, I mean, if you
Right.
can achieve your ends in a reasonable way, with some, perhaps with some compromise involved, okay. Anyway, I've shared my point of view.
Well, you've shared your point of view, but I want to say that this is really something that needs to be settled. Under the Hazelwood guidelines, the advisor is extremely vulnerable. The advisor is responsible for every word that goes in. Now, I'm not saying I don't want to take responsibility, but I really feel that this is something that the students produce, and it really should be run under the Tinker guidelines, where the advisor uses the strength of her personality and wisdom to convince them in the right direction, and then leave the content decisions up to them. I feel strongly
Okay,
about
well,
that.
we will certainly follow this, and if at an appropriate time you'd like to come back and give us an update, we'd be interested to hear. Let's take the last couple minutes just to address one related issue. I admired your frankness in recognizing that Ithaca High School is a very liberal institution, and you say that you're very pleased and proud of that fact. But by the same token, it's a public school. There are children there from families who do not look kindly upon the fact that it's a liberal institution. And to me, this raises the issue of school choice, and which is something we address often on the show. Well, what do you say to parents who cannot afford to send their children to private school and are forced to pay property taxes so that they would have to pay double, in essence, once for their property taxes and then again a second time if they wanted to send their kids to a private or parochial school, and simply cannot afford to do so, and say, look, yes, it is a liberal environment, and I do not feel comfortable with my child being there. Shouldn't it be a more neutral environment? And something I like to point out, we have an alternative school, which is like we have the normal liberal Ithaca High School, and then we have, for those of you for whom it's not liberal enough, we have the hyper-liberal ACS. If we're going to have an alternative in this district, shouldn't the alternative be a more traditional conservative school? Your thoughts?
Well, I think that most of the people at Ithaca High School are liberal, but I don't think that it is run as a liberal institution. I would say that, all right, well, that's another show. Certainly the way I run my classroom is not liberal. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
I am, I'm liberal, but I'm really quite a conservative educator.
Mm-hmm.
And
then again, if I may say, you teach math and computer science, which do not have intrinsically political aspects to them. But I mean, I'm not really sure, I'm not confident that the same standards that you apply in your class are applied by teachers in, I don't know, history and social studies and more, and in classes that more directly relate to politics.
Don't you think, though, that the school reflects the community?
Well, I mean, is that, certainly no. I don't think, I mean, it might reflect the dominant, but what about respect for the significant minority?
Oh, I think they respect. I think they respect them.
Well, I think it might be difficult for people who are in the dominant majority to appreciate how disrespected, to use a word that I don't really like, those who are in the minority feel, and how
Really?
excluded, and how they feel that their values are tread upon, and
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
that they
That's
feel
true.
uncomfortable with having their children in the school system, and yet they feel trapped because they simply can't afford to pay twice for the children's education. I mean, since you are a great proponent of choice and freedom of expression, for example, let me turn the question on you, Rob. Do you tend to favor vouchers that would give parents the chance to choose the kind of education and the kind of values with which their children would be inculcated in school?
Well, I mean, I'd hope to create an environment in school where a particular sort of student does not feel intimidated. I know that Ithaca High School has produced quite a few notable Republicans. I know that, I'm thinking of Paul Wolfowitz, for example. I'm thinking of Ari Rapkin, who went on to Cornell and is writing basically all of the conservative papers. It's not like they're smothered. In fact, it gives them an opportunity to clearly define their opinions.
You are definitely going to have to come back because we are completely out of time. So let me end by thanking Roselyn Teukolsky, faculty advisor to the Ithaca High School Tattler, editor-in-chief Rob Ochshorn. Thank you very, very much for coming in. Good discussion. Thanks to our crew. Let's see. We have Peter Davis, Joey Kilmer, Stu Carpenter, Monica Waldron, and Takia Harris. Thank you all very much. To our studio audience, Saul Teukolsky, John Ochshorn, our photographer from the Ithaca High School Tattler. Thank you. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to our sponsor, Domino's Pizza. To our audience, thank you for joining us this evening. And please join us again next week for another edition of Right Angle. Good night.